do. And we're live on Facebook. Hi, everyone joining us on Facebook. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the troubled history of schizophrenia, how race shaped an illness. For those of you joining us through Facebook, please feel free to comment or ask a question on the live stream. Those comments and questions will be forwarded up to us as well. For those of you joining us on Zoom, please feel free to say hello and share questions and comments in the chat. We are a pretty big group, but there are going to be some opportunities for us to hear from you throughout the presentation. So please use the chat to do that. And feel free to ask questions as we go along. We will be saving all questions until the end, but I will be keeping track of those questions throughout, and we'll be saving them to ask our presenter at the end. Okay, so, all right, it looks like we still have some folks joining us, but I do want to get started. Welcome again, everyone, to those of you who may have joined while I was in the middle of my previous spiel. Welcome again. We're really excited to have you. My name is Clara. I'm the outreach coordinator at NAMI NYC, the National Alliance on Mental Illness of New York City. So I'm going to be just saying a few quick words to introduce NAMI NYC, and then I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Dr. Smith. NAMI NYC, as many of you I'm sure are aware, is a grassroots mental health organization. Our mission is to provide support, education, and advocacy for individuals and families impacted by mental illness. We provide free classes and support groups and other programs, both for people that are dealing with their own mental health issues and those who are supporting family members and loved ones who are dealing with mental health issues. Right now, all of our programs are running remotely by phone and video conferencing like this one. And you can find out more about all of our programs by going to our website at naminyc.org or calling our helpline. I'm going to put that information in the chat very shortly, but I want to say it out loud for everyone who may be listening and not necessarily paying attention to the chat, although I can see all of the places, I'm seeing all the places that people are joining us from. It's really exciting. We're really pleased to welcome such a broad array of attendees. So again, thanks so much for joining us for this really exciting topic. The last thing I want to say about our programs is that they're all peer-led. So our support groups and classes for people dealing with mental health issues are facilitated and taught by people living with mental health issues. Our programs for family members and loved ones are facilitated by family members and loved ones, people who have experience supporting someone in their personal lives and who can share that experience with other people who are joining us. So we're just trying to create that space where folks can share what they have been through in a place where with other people who have been through something similar. So that's what we're trying to do. We hope that you enjoy this presentation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker this evening. He is Dr. Stephen Smith, a licensed clinical psychologist who obtained his doctorate in clinical forensic psychology from the CUNY Graduate Center. After completing his doctorate, Dr. Smith went on to the University of Pennsylvania to complete his postdoctoral training, and his training and expertise have focused on providing recovery-focused therapeutic approaches through a structural and cultural competency lens. So he has specific interests in exploring issues related to racial disparities in psychiatric practices, which this presentation obviously explores in detail, including bias and assessments of violence. Dr. Smith currently works as a clinical trainer for a program at Columbia University, and he has a small Brooklyn-based private practice where he provides psychotherapy specifically for men of color. So let's put our applause emojis together for our speaker, Dr. Smith.
All right, Clara, thank you so much for that warm welcome. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be able to speak with the NAMI community and those listening in. I see from the chat, we have people from all around, so that's really exciting to see. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who's able to join. So as was mentioned, we're going to be talking about the history of schizophrenia, really. A lot of this information, it might be a little bit didactic, just to provide information, but I really encourage just a discussion. And as Claire mentioned, we'll take some points to just kind of open it up and just reflect on either some of the stuff that we've been presenting today or some thoughts that you might be having as you're listening in. But we'll give you a kind of a prompt for when we start to open it up a little bit. All right. So let me go ahead and get started. So I figured kind of the best way to start this kind of quote unquote history lesson is to actually start at present day, right? And kind of the most glaring statistic that we see a lot in the field of psychiatry and psychology is this. Black psychiatric individuals are 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with a schizophrenia disorder when compared to their white counterparts, right? 2 to 3 times. In some research, it actually goes up to 4 times. That's a very alarming statistic. And alarming because when you actually break it down, there isn't actually any racial differences in prevalence rates of schizophrenia. So the question might be, how is that, right? So what do we mean by prevalence rates? So essentially, if you can control for all of the variables, right? So you're controlling for the history of the illness that the person has, controlling for gender, neighborhood, all of these different factors, and you're comparing people across different racial groups. After controlling, you'll see that there actually is no difference between schizophrenia in the white community and schizophrenia in the Black community. It basically affects people equally, right? So the question then is, if it affects people equally, why are people diagnosed differently, right? And what a ton of research has pointed out is that there's racial bias in how people are diagnosed. There's racial bias in how psychiatric individuals are assessed and get the diagnoses of schizophrenia. So that's a lot of what we're going to dive into, right? We know that's a fact right now. The question is, how did we get there, right? And not just how, but kind of why. I'm hoping that we could chip away at that question more so, right? And we'll do it in kind of a number of ways. First, what's going to be kind of the basis for this presentation is this really interesting book called The Protest Psychosis, and it's how schizophrenia became a Black disease. And it's written by a psychiatrist named Dr. Jonathan Metzel. And in this, he was looking at answering that very question, right? Of why is it that Black people are diagnosed more with schizophrenia than other racial groups, specifically their white counterparts? So in his book, and it serves more as an ethnographic study than actually just a research book, but he's looking specifically at the evolution of the disorder, right? And he's doing this in a number of ways. What he wanted to explore was threefold. And this is really going to be kind of the lines of focus for this talk, right? So Metzel was interested in exploring first kind of what's the broader context that's happening over time, and how does that broader context shape what we understand about mental illness, what we understand about social behavior, and just kind of what we understand about how we relate to one another, right? So he was really interested first in what's this broader context. Second, he wanted to get at, okay, so if we understand the broad picture, what happens in society, how do we understand kind of specific practices, clinical practices, right? And how society can interface with what happens when you meet with a client, right? Again, these broader external issues impacting the very thing, the very interaction you have with the client, the very interaction doctors have with their patients. So he looked at diagnostic practices, and we'll take a look at how the DSM, which some of you may or may not be aware of, how the DSM actually shifted over time. And then we'll also take a look at kind of more specifically in a nuanced way, how practice and context changed at a specific hospital. And Metzel used this as kind of the microcosm to exemplify how diagnoses change over time and how the social context can actually impact at this very hospital. All right, so we're gonna kind of comb through and navigate these three different lenses. Let me first kind of just go back and just talk really quickly about the DSM. I mentioned that in the previous slide about this kind of diagnostic practice. The DSM, which stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is essentially the Bible in psychiatry, right? It's a handbook that mental health professionals use to basically make diagnoses, right? They use this in a number of ways. It has a ton of different criteria, has a ton of different disorders, and people use that when seeing clients and when they need to actually assess and categorize what's going on for the individual. So this is your Bible in terms of how to diagnose people, right? It's based on a ton of empirical data. It's based on a ton of clinical expertise, mostly from researchers and clinicians, which we'll get to in a little bit as to why that's so limiting. And it's often used as a way to not just diagnose, but to make treatment recommendations, right? And unfortunately, it's also used as a main mechanism for insurance payments, right? Insurance payments need to know what a person is diagnosed with in order to provide fees and reimbursements. All right. So, and here's just kind of the evolution of the DSM. Started kind of, there's a ton of different iterations in between these, but these are the main ones, 1 through 5. Right? So let's kind of go back to where it started, right? Schizophrenia has been around for a long time, but it really came into kind of the public arena in around the 1920s, between the 1920s and 1930s. Around that time in the US, so schizophrenia actually, the word schizophrenia came from Europe and just kind of migrated over here. And in the US, schizophrenia was originally thought of as an illness of personality, right? It had cognitive elements of it. So it was this idea that people had what's called mental confusion or fragmented thinking. But the connotation behind this illness was one of almost like a gift, right? It was something that was given to artists, intellectuals, eccentrics, poets. So individuals that were kind of a little bit out of the mainstream in their thinking, and they were considered to be just different, but in what I would say in a good way, a more adaptive way in terms of how society saw them, right? So the treatment also, by seeing individuals as kind of having these gifts or kind of thinking outside of the mainstream, the treatment also shifted. The treatment was different for them, right? Treatment for them focused on redirection, nurturing their talents, right? Helping them engage in recreational activities, art. You'd see oftentimes at these psych wards, these individuals were outside playing games, or were painting, or were kind of tending to the garden, right? It was the treatment focused on helping them function and basically learn to use their skills to their advantage, right? And there's a heavy emphasis on psychotherapy. In the 1920s and 30s, this kind of new schizophrenia was predominantly reserved for white males, right? You'd see white males in the psych wards. It's not to say that other people didn't have schizophrenia, but they just weren't given the same type of attention, right? So Black people, for instance, also had schizophrenia, but they were ignored, often put into kind of worser conditions, particularly in the South, right? They were ignored in the scientific research, they were ignored in media. So we didn't really know anything outside of what was happening to white people, particularly white males that had this form of schizophrenia. So Metzel, thinking about kind of what we know about schizophrenia in the 1920s and 30s, also was interested in what was happening at this specific hospital, Ionia State Hospital. And this hospital was located a little bit outside of Detroit, Michigan, right? So what was going on in the 1920s and 30s as in terms of our understanding of patients and patients with schizophrenia? The hospital at this time, again, mirrored kind of what society thought, right? It was predominantly white males. You'll see this was taken directly from the book. So the term Negroes was what was written back then in the 1920s and 30s to describe Black patients, right? So predominantly male, predominantly white, predominantly male. And yeah, here's an excerpt from the book. I didn't really want to recreate this, so I figured it best just to kind of capture what was in the protest psychosis book. So in the 1930s, going into the 1950s, this was how they characterized people with schizophrenia, right? And you'll see the kind of the difference between how Black people with schizophrenia and how white people were characterized. Black people were thought of as being a little bit more restless, more suspicious, paranoid, but actually white people were seen as being more dangerous, right? Both white and Black people evidenced the same type of aggression, or were described to evidence the same type of aggression and hostility, right? Thinking about other characteristics, white psychiatric individuals with schizophrenia were more likely to evidence quote unquote depression, or again, I should say described as evidencing quote unquote more depression, more confused states, somewhat equal in terms of cooperation, and Black people were slightly more seen as being more withdrawn, right? So that's kind of the 1920s to 1930s. Now we're going to get into schizophrenia and how it evolves in the next decades, right? 1930s to 50s. So in the 1930s, so we had in the 1920s where schizophrenia was this illness of personality, particularly assigned to white men. Over time, schizophrenia then evolved in society to be considered not an illness of personality, but a personality disorder brought by the pressures of white civilization. So what do we mean by that? Essentially, it was a way to describe people that weren't adjusting well to white society, to white civilization. Interestingly enough, this disorder, this description and disorder were assigned mostly to middle-class white women. So the history of schizophrenia wasn't kind to white women either, right? The white women were often described as they were being driven to insanity by the dual pressures of housework and motherhood, right? So this idea that white women, white psychiatric individuals got schizophrenia because they couldn't handle the pressures of housework. They couldn't handle the pressures of motherhood. And pretty wild that this was actually a thing, right? Some quotes from some pretty reputable journals, right? So they talked too loudly, embarrassed their husbands. They were described as having this split personality that rendered them incapable of fulfilling their duties. Often kind of described as a Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde. And this is where a lot of the notions of the schizophrenogenic mother kind of came about, right? Again, this idea that these types of individuals couldn't handle society and the pressures of being a good citizen. The DSM, so that was kind of society's view. The DSM kind of was birthed around this time as society was seeing schizophrenia in this way. And the DSM kind of had the same type of consistent message, right? They saw disorders in general as reactions to life stressors, right? So nothing necessarily internal, but it was something that you were reacting to. The language in the DSM was gender neutral, passive. They termed this thing called schizophrenic reaction. And again, it's disturbances in reality and relationships, emotional disharmony, regressive behavior. So these women that couldn't handle quote unquote housework and motherhood were seen as exhibiting regressive behaviors. There's no mention of aggression, hostility. They were more seen as kind of reacting in ways that felt like they were more docile in reaction to these kind of bigger stressors. Here's a kind of a picture, an interesting picture from a few different magazines around that time. Let's kind of pause here. These are kind of descriptions and advertisements for medication. Let's kind of pause here. I want to maybe just open it up really quickly. What do you guys notice about these pictures, these images depicting clients? All of these are kind of antipsychotic medications. And Claire, if I could just have you maybe read out if anyone's chiming in.
Absolutely. Yes. So folks are saying they're all women. A lot of folks are, many of them are white. They look happy. They're all doing work. They look passive, calm. Couple people saying housework. They're being kept busy. They're engaged in some sort of, different kind of works. One person said mother's little helper.
Right. Right.
Very nice. They're generally cooperative, calm, subservient. Somebody else said a sense of normalcy. Yeah, looks like a workshop, almost like a workshop, white only. Very docile. Yeah.
Yeah,
Well
that's
kept.
great. Yeah, that's, I mean,
And
you guys
not,
captured
a couple of these people said they're not interacting with each other. They're very, somebody said Stepford wives.
Right.
Yeah, clean and cooperative.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. You guys captured it, right? So they're doing things. You could see they're knitting. They're kind of calm, docile. These are supposed to be psychiatric words. If you look at even the Thorazine, the way it's described makes patients accessible, receptive to psychotherapy, improves ward morale, right? You see this kind of image on the right with the kid that's running around with the cowboy hat. Again, it's this idea that the mother is having quote unquote a breakdown because their kids are running around, and the vacuum is neatly placed to suggest that they're having a difficult time keeping up, right? And these medications are intended to just kind of help them realign, right? Kind of correct, quote unquote, that split personality, that reaction that they're having, right? Clean, cooperative, and communicative, right? Those are the words used to describe these types of individuals that have carried diagnoses at this point of schizophrenia.
Can you share do you know what year these ads are from specifically? I know they're all from the 50s.
Yeah, this one is from the 1955. Yeah. So around that time again, right? So it shifted from a kind of a way of seeing schizophrenia as this eccentric gift, particularly kind of affecting white males, and moved into the 30s and 50s, more something assigned to white women as a way to explain their inability to deal with stressors. Yeah. Any other questions, thoughts?
one person shared, these snapshots make me so mad.
Yeah.
And a couple people kind of are referencing the fact that this is a time of large institutions, which I think is a history that a lot of folks have strong reactions to.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's very true. And I saw also the question: are these people, do they all have schizophrenia? It's a great question. I don't think we know that, right? But they're used to they're used for advertisements that are targeting schizophrenia, right? So these antipsychotic medications. So this may not even be an accurate portrayal of what it might be like, but this was used in terms of to convey the message that, you know, we have something for that. We have something for the mothers out there. Yeah. Okay. I see someone reminds me of sane and insane places. That's exactly right. So this is happening around the 1930s and 50s. But what happened after that was really interesting. At the state hospital, as Metzel kind of dug more closely as to kind of how the patients moved over time, what he found was by the time 1950s and into the 60s rolled in, something happened, right? There was this huge shift in the census. The hospitals were given more money. There were hospitals popping up left and right. There were also kind of a huge pipeline created of individuals coming from local prisons and other parts of the states were now kind of being driven and housed in these state hospitals, right? And in this expansion and these kind of these developed pipelines, the demographics of this state hospital changed, right? It changed from being a predominantly white hospital and now saw a huge increase in Black patients, particularly Black males. And not just an increase in Black males, but a conversive decrease in white males, in white psychiatric individuals. Here's a look, Metzel provided a look of about around 1956 at the census, right? As you'll see, the number of Black people, Black males in particular, jumped by about 40%. They made up 40% of the census. It jumped up about 16% in 6 years, right? Which is huge for a given time. So the question is kind of what happened, right? And Metzel did some more digging, and what he found out was that not just did the census increase, but the number of people diagnosed with schizophrenia, specifically schizophrenia, increased exponentially, right? And what he looked at intake forms, he looked at treatment notes, he looked at discharge plans, and what he found was that these individuals didn't really differ from other individuals that were being brought into the wards, right? The symptoms were kind of the same, right? But the number of people with schizophrenia increased. And also over time, those people that entered the system, entered these wards that may not have had schizophrenia or may have had schizophrenia, the description of their schizophrenia started to shift over time, right? So you have this increase in diagnoses of people with schizophrenia, and then you have this interesting shift in the descriptions and the criteria for schizophrenia that occurred between the 1950s and 60s. And what really kind of was astounding, this is my attempt at capturing in a very exaggerated way, capturing kind of this shift, is the number of white people, white psychiatric clients that were diagnosed with schizophrenia by like the 1960s decreased drastically. And then the number of Black psychiatric patients diagnosed with schizophrenia increased drastically, right? So this portion right here in blue is what happened that created almost this inverse effect, right? What happened that led to this drastic increase? And so that's kind of the big question is why, right? And the answer, unfortunately, is simple: the civil rights movement, right? The civil rights movement of the 1960s and 70s greatly accelerated the increase in diagnoses of schizophrenia. We know that the civil rights movement was a time of a lot of racial tension. It was time when a lot of Black people in America were speaking up about the racial injustices, about the inequities and inequalities that they were experiencing, right? And for the first time in probably the history of this country, Black people were united in their demands, right? In terms of their dissatisfaction with government, dissatisfaction with society. So this led to obvious increase in tensions, or specifically around race. Images of angry Black men and women protesting in the streets were rampant, right? And I should have kind of underscored this idea of angry, because what is perceived as angry to one might not be perceived as angry to another. But this was kind of plastered all across media, right? Black people protesting, Black people yelling, raising their fist and protesting. And not only were there images kind of being plastered about society, but there were also rises in kind of different forms of protest, right? There were rises in nonviolent protests in the South and violence is necessary protests in the North. So this kind of increase in racial angst and tension, and then also this increase in kind of questioning society contributed a lot to kind of what we see today. So that was what was happening in society. The DSM, this kind of Bible of psychiatry, also started to shift, right? Shifted in very interesting ways. Whereas before, in the beginning, it was an illness of kind of a reaction, right? Then it started to shift now during the civil rights era, and started to really be described as how do we account for these external factors that played a part in someone developing disorders, right? So it put more emphasis on external factors. Whereas before it was gender neutral, passive. Now a lot of the descriptions involve male pronouns, right? Small subtle shifts in the pronouns. Schizophrenia specifically shifted from this reaction to now a misinterpretation of reality, right? So the individual that develops schizophrenia is misinterpreting reality, and their misinterpretations is self-protective. Inappropriate emotional responses, lack of empathy with others. This was how people were diagnosed, not just described, but diagnosed. So if you met these criteria, you were likely to get a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Schizophrenia paranoid type, a certain type of schizophrenia. Patients' attitudes frequently hostile and aggressive. His behavior tends to be consistent with delusions. The patient manifests the mechanism of projection. So there's this heavy psychodynamic lean to suggest that the individual is projecting, meaning they're saying something about other people when it's really about them, right? Attributes characteristics that they cannot accept within themselves to other people. We're going to get into a little bit of what that actually means. So the nomenclature, the mechanism, this guide shifted as the world was shifting. There is also an emphasis on kind of masculinized hostility, aggression, and defiant behavior. Again, this mirrored the social context and mirrored the tension and the angst surrounding racial unrest. And what it ended up doing is it allowed people, particularly mental health professionals and larger society actually, to pathologize Black people's reactions during this time, pathologize protest, and by proxy, pathologize being Black specifically during this time. going back to Metzel, going back to what was going on at the state hospital around here. He looked at the records, and in the 1960s to 70s, there was a huge shift in how patients with schizophrenia were now being described. Now they were being described as hostile, incredibly more hostile than their white counterparts, more aggressive. There were issues with police, disturbed. I mean, if you look across, Black people were seen as essentially more hostile, aggressive, and threatening, right? White people, white psychiatric patients in this hospital, on the other hand, were seen as being more cooperative, right? They had more of the affective component, depressed, withdrawn, suicidal, right? Whereas the Black psychiatric patients had more of the quote unquote behavioral component, right? Huge shift in the way people were seen just over time. This wasn't the only thing happening, right? In the community, the psychiatric community, also there was a huge shift, right? Whereas before, when it was white people that were diagnosed with these psychiatric conditions, now with civil rights, more and more Black people were given this diagnosis. And now there was a huge interest in researching Black psychiatric patients. Before there wasn't, now there's a huge interest, right? And the interest came in the form of understanding or trying to understand, compare and contrast Black people and white people, right? Black people with schizophrenia versus white people with schizophrenia. But it was biased. They weren't looking to contrast. They were looking specifically to say, why are Black people with schizophrenia hostile? How do we understand their rage and paranoia and delusions, right? There are often claims in a lot of the research articles of pre-morbid cultural patterns. Black people react out of proportion, show lower emotional threshold, and heightened tension, right? This is what was in research articles, right? And the researchers often linked the findings of Black schizophrenia to the civil rights movement, right? Oftentimes to parts of the civil rights movement, the Black Panther movement, right? The more violence is necessary, right? Those individuals were seen as being more likely to evidence hostile aspects of schizophrenia. This led to kind of the namesake of the book that Metzel wrote, called The Protest Psychosis. If you ever have a moment, look this article up. It is, I mean, bizarre and horrifying, but this was actually an article written in a very reputable psychiatric journal, and it's called The Protest Psychosis. Again, this is what Dr. Metzel was responding to and was interested in. Some quotes from the article. It's basically the authors were interested in understanding what it is about the Black version of schizophrenia that we need to understand. And they made a ton of different wild claims. Here are some just listed. They said that these individuals had bizarre religious and racial aspects that we didn't see before in schizophrenia. They changed their names to Islamic names, denying their previous Anglicization of their names. So denying their Anglo-Saxon names and changing it to Islamic names means that there's something delusional happening. There's an emotional inappropriateness. There's a repression in their ability to relate to white officials, denial of white values. Their disassociation represented a refusal to accept language of standard English. Their aggression was unconscious, right? And it represented the guilt that they felt by not adjusting to white culture. Again, if you have a moment, I'll definitely provide this article, but read this article. This was written in 1968 by, again, a pretty reputable journal. And the authors, Bromberg and Simon, claimed that Black men particularly developed hostile and aggressive feelings after listening to Black Panther leaders, right? So the mere fact that they were listening to Muslim-led groups, Black Panther leaders, meant that they were going to develop these hostile and aggressive feelings, and that meant that they had psychosis. Their behaviors were seen as a delusional rebuke of white society. So it's not that they are just having symptoms of psychosis, but their psychosis is driven, according to the authors, by their lack of acceptance of white society, their rebuke of white society. They term this, it's not clinical schizophrenia, it's protest psychosis. The act of protest qualified them for a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Metzel kind of summed it up really well. Defining Black protests as insane was far more advantageous than taking seriously the content of that protest or allowing it to disrupt the function of white bourgeois society, right? So he's getting a little bit at the intentionality behind the way that people started to see schizophrenia and started to see Black individuals. Also, around this time, not just the DSM shifted, not just society's views shifted, but there was this huge increase in chemical interventions. Now, why is that important? Whereas before, if we think about how schizophrenia was treated before, right? It's recreational treatment, psychotherapy, right? Leaning into their strengths. Now there's this huge increase in chemical interventions, which I think is kind of the more easier way to give aspects of control, right? There's a huge increase in antipsychotic medications around this time. And it also coincided with huge increases in hospital censuses around the country. Interestingly, as we saw kind of the advertisements for, early advertisements for antipsychotic medications depicting white women, the advertisements then started to shift towards depicting images of Black people, particularly Black aggression. I'm gonna just kind of park here as an example of some of the advertisements, and maybe we could just take a moment to just reflect, gather some thoughts. I'd love to hear some impressions about this. If we could open it up, Clara, and get some kind of impressions. What are people thinking, reacting to this image?
Yes, it looks like an African mask.
What else do you guys notice?
Kind of scary.
Yeah, kind of. Oops, sorry, let's go back. Yeah.
The idea of savagery. The devil made me do it. Seems kind of dehumanizing and very disturbing. Yeah. Associating tribal masks with mental illness, dark, angry, demonic, suggests schizophrenia has roots in African culture. Just exaggerated, fiendish smile, degrading the art of the mask. Very disturbing, theatrical, racist, almost unrecognizable and kind of dehumanizing, a negative appropriation of African culture. No longer showing the desired benefits of the medication, so calm or positivity. The mask is male, has connotations of being male. Somebody brought the point that's similar to how Black men were depicted in Birth of a Nation. Just, yeah, negative connotations and savage imagery. Yeah. Very different from what was displayed with female patients.
Right, exactly. I mean, just kind of take a look at this, right? What kind of jumps out is exactly what was said, right? Dehumanizing, right? These kind of African artifacts were used as a way to become the fake. And even it says, remove the mask of schizophrenia, right? It now became the face of schizophrenia, right? I love the comment about the negative benefits, right? Or taking away any of the positive benefits, right? We'll get to another slide that actually suggests what the positive benefits are, and it's just as disturbing. But yeah, why do we need to do this, right? That's the question that we got to figure out, right? Why the shift from advertising or showing schizophrenia or antipsychotic medications as this treatment for white women that restores docility to now this very dehumanized, Afrocentric kind of negative connotation. Yeah. And this is what people were seeing. This is kind of the message people were getting. I want to maybe open it up for even another image, right? This, again, from a very reputable journal. And this one is for Haldol, which is still a go-to medication for the treatment of psychosis. What are some comments? What do you notice about this picture?
Angry Black woman.
Mm-hmm.
Again, morphing, there's emphasis on the fist. There's a fist raised, perpetuation of white supremacy. Yeah, Black Power fist, somebody else brought that. Just very angry, aggressive, looks like a protester at a civil rights rally, looks like James Brown. Again, implications of rage, violence, aggression, also dehumanizing and instilling fear. There's a morph of the human form, so it's not, again, dehumanizing. Stereotypical, reflecting fears of Black emotion. She's dressed up, not at home. That's an interesting point. The viewer, it feels as though the viewer will be the recipient of the aggression. Hysteria, playing on fear of a Black person. The person might be at a piano. I can't quite tell the background, but potentially targeting artists. Inhuman appearance. Just looking sort of hysterical. Lines are blurred to remove us from the person's humanity.
Wow.
There's a reflection of what looks like maybe fire on her face. And the heading emphasizes cooperation rather than any kind of compassion, health, or healing. Yeah, the couple people mentioned that. The goal is cooperation instead of healing. Maybe she's in front of a courthouse. Yeah, the background is a little unclear. I think you could read it a couple of ways, but some people might mention that might be the background.
I would, and you guys are, I mean, I just love the way you're depicting this, right? There's, again, another kind of dehumanizing look to this. Was an aggressive look, the inverted fist. Someone said that, which I just love, like the viewer is potentially the recipient of the depiction of the aggression, right? The colors. What do we notice, even just thinking about the text, right? What do we notice about how it's described compared to kind of decades before?
Yeah, somebody else brought the point of the masculinization of Black women. Yeah, again, the clenched, angry fist. Usually leaves patients relatively alert and responsive from the copy, but we must act. The implication being we must act quickly to control.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah.
yeah. Looks wild and almost animalistic.
Yeah. Wild, animalistic, belligerent, assaultive. I love the what you guys are picking up on of kind of usually leaves patients relatively alert and responsive. Acts now to reduce the risk. Control aggressive and assaultive behavior. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Again, this is happening on the heels of the civil rights movement, right? This shift in how we think of schizophrenia, and particularly with this, the treatment of schizophrenia.
Yeah, depicting a justification of why control is needed, I think is a great summary of the image.
Yes, and we're going to go back to that point, right? This idea of control, which I think is kind of prevalent throughout many of our systems. This idea of controlling certain parts of our population. Great, thank you guys. So this was happening both in kind of the specific state hospital. This was happening in the psychiatric community, but it was also happening in kind of our larger society, right? Mainstream media from 1960s and 70s often took on this label of schizophrenia and used it in a way that, as usual, makes things worse, right? Media mixed clinical diagnosis and terms with embellishments, especially when reporting on civil rights movement. So the metaphor, schizophrenia was used as a metaphor in a lot of different media outlets, a lot of different journals, as a way of explaining the racial upheaval, right? As a way of explaining society's conflicted notions of unity. One descriptor, when explaining Black behavior, people were of split minds. Black people were of split minds, torn between their love for the country and desires to destroy it. Society, this kind of split person is kind of where we got the term schizophrenia from, right? Schizophrenia was used to describe split mind. Now it's being used as a way to describe the way Black people in America were responding to racism. And the underlying message was that Black people were the illness. Now, conversely, there was also a way that schizophrenia was being used in Black society and in Black media around this time. In Black society, they actually, for a lot of people, they embraced this idea of schizophrenia, but they did so for different reasons, right? For a lot of leaders, schizophrenia was a way to explain what was happening to Black people as a result of the racism that they have been subjected to. Schizophrenia was this, it was a given. This was how we adapt to the ills of racism in our racist past, right? White people and white society were the illness, not Black people. What white people did caused Black people to react this way, right? And the notion was, how can white America promote unity abroad, but practice hatred at home? And a lot of civil rights leaders embraced this ideology that promoted Black people experiencing a metaphorical schizophrenia. So it's almost as though it's an awakening for Black people, right? That they are now splitting from society and awakening to new ways of looking at their worth. So, Metzel, in kind of doing this kind of ethnographic look, this research, really was able to conclude that this overdiagnosis, this shift in the diagnosis of schizophrenia resulted primarily by anxieties from the civil rights movement. Black people were now being diagnosed and being considered more likely to have schizophrenia because of the way that they were responding to the civil rights movement. The clinical presentations didn't change, right? Nothing changed. How we described it and the criteria changed over time. Medical staff interpreted the presentations differently. So This presentation, if it would have happened 30 years ago, might not have been given schizophrenia, but because it happened during the time of civil unrest, it changed the way mental health professionals started to see their clients. Symptoms were seen as more hostile, seen as more aggressive, more uncooperative, and thus more dangerous. His other finding was that this overdiagnosis and exaggeration of Black males as being more likely to have schizophrenia was also done so in the media and psychiatry, but was done not just in reaction to the civil rights movement, but was done specifically to undermine the civil rights movement, right? They racialized schizophrenia. Being Black was pathologized. And as such, these individuals needed to be controlled. They were seen as threats to society and need to be controlled and contained. Hence the influx of people to psychiatric wards, hence the increase in chemical interventions, hence the increase in diagnoses of schizophrenia. This idea of they are a threat and in need of control. Now, I want to say that this kind of period over the last, half a century is new, but it actually isn't, right? Our society has labeled Black angst, Black behavior in ways that just, it's really hard to fathom. They have pathologized Black behavior in so many ways, dating back to the 1850s. There's a term called drapetomania, where psychiatrists, mental health professionals believe that slaves who ran away from their masters did so because they had a mental illness. So again, this breaking with societal norms by running away means that you had an underlying disorder. Why else would you run away if not for a mental illness? There's another term coined around this time, which I'm not even going to try to pronounce, but it's basically this idea that Black people, Black slaves were seen as exhibiting rascality, disrespect the master's property, meaning that anytime they disrespected, something must have been wrong. They were exhibiting mental illness. And the only cure was to whip them and subject them to further enslavement. So I wanted to present this both as just kind of a commentary on a very well-known stat about the overdiagnosis of schizophrenia, but also to show kind of the present day impacts of this overdiagnosis of schizophrenia. This is just the tip of the iceberg, right? So not only are Black people, Black psychiatric individuals more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia, but Black people are also more likely to be prescribed first-generation antipsychotic medications. And these medications, again, going back to kind of the Haloperidol, Thorazine, these medications have been found to produce more harmful side effects, extrapyramidal side effects that that we often see for individuals in the psychiatric wards, right? So they're not as likely as their white counterparts to be given medications that have reduced side effects. Black people are more likely to be hospitalized involuntarily, right? Not only are they more likely to be hospitalized involuntarily, but when they get to the hospital, they're more likely to be subjected to coercive means. So that means being isolated or being held down and being forced to give medication, right? Also more likely to be seen for less time during their evals once in the hospital, more likely after their treatment to be referred to outpatient programs as opposed to individual therapy programs, kind of these more day treatment programs that we see. Black people are more likely to be referred to those as opposed to kind of the more standard group practices or clinics. So I'm just kind of coming to the end, but I want to just kind of think about kind of the different ways that schizophrenia has evolved and how society shifted our understanding of schizophrenia, particularly as a response to social unrest, right? And the questions, I have a few questions, but maybe we could kind of park here for a second. The first question is, why is this happening, right? I think we kind of went through as to how it happened, but we didn't really get to why. Why are Black people seen as more threatening, aggressive, or more likely to exhibit these types of seen as exhibiting psychosis and schizophrenia? What is it that people see? What are the biases that people see when they look at Black people behavior? This is a question. If you have any comments you'd like to answer, we could definitely open it up, maybe for a brief moment to see if anyone was thinking that. Just reading through. Wow, you guys have some great comments. Claire, I don't know if you're able to kind of read through some of it.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was responding to someone in the chat. So not much has changed in our society, especially in terms of darker skinned Black people. Perceiving Black people as violent and aggressive is ingrained. So all of this history has really become internalized. Fear and control, labeling destroys credibility. Someone, not exactly a response to the question, but a great point is no wonder the Black community is not very trusting of therapy, especially as most therapists are white. Oh, sorry. Could you repeat the question? I think.
No problem. Yeah. So the question, and a lot of the chat has been getting at this, like, why is this still happening? Why are Black people still being overdiagnosed? And just kind of in line with what people are saying, the control, the labeling, the projection of their own things, white privilege. Yeah, all these, I think all these are playing a role, right? And the question is, how do we start to change that? Yeah.
One person says not understanding the response that people have had to trauma, which I think is a great point. Medicine has become a business and has trained individuals to receive treatment a certain way. Black people mistrust the medical community. They may wait to visit a doctor when symptoms are more severe, which may also may perpetuate the cycle. Control, just racism, the stigma associated with mental illness is a way to hide racism within it.
And this is really, I love exactly what you guys are saying. There's kind of faults in society, there's faults in systems, there's this over perception of Black people, particularly Black men, as risk. And we're seeing that, we've seen that for years, but we've been seeing it a lot specifically for individuals that have mental health conditions, right? We know that a lot of untrained individuals are making judgments about what they see and making attributions about what they see for people that have mental health concerns. And oftentimes it's this increase in perceptions of risk and violence, and then the need for more coercive treatments to control, to justify the need to control these individuals and keep them from society, right? And we could say this about so many systems, right? It's whether we're talking about kids in school being expelled and punished and detained, or we're talking about the criminal justice system and the overrepresentation of Black people in those systems. We know that this is a through line in a lot of the different systems, unfortunately, in our nation, right? And the mental health system, it's not a surprise that it happens here, right? One thing that we have to also consider is present day, right? We're going through somewhat of a similar situation where there is a lot of racial unrest, where people are speaking up. Black Lives Matter is a great example of kind of let's increase attention about what is going on in society. Are we going to see the same types of um, results where more people are going to be locked up, or more people are going to be hospitalized, more people are going to be sent to the ER, given a diagnosis of schizophrenia or some other behavioral label, right? This is something that we have to just kind of keep our eye on, and why that happens, right? And as kind of Metzel laid out, it's often a reaction by society to the angst and anxiety they feel as it relates to racial tension, right? So it's really important that we start to understand what are going to be the effects of this time around. You know, the other question that I have is less about kind of this history and more about, were you aware of this history? And if so, why, or if not, why, right? Why were you, why is this something new, right? For the majority of folks that I know, nobody's ever heard of this. Nobody's ever heard of such bias or the link between civil rights and schizophrenia. And so my question is just going to be, why do you think you haven't heard about this? And then obviously for those that have, why did you hear about it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of folks, you know, some people saying they have no idea. They knew a little, but not to this degree. Have not heard of it, but I'm not surprised. Not until recently, history and healthcare education curricula teach racism as a thing of the past, allowing white people in control of these systems to not address the underlying racism that is still very much present. There's a whole lot of folks coming in, so appreciate it, but we are probably not going to be able to respond to everybody. Right. But yeah, a couple people saying after hearing it, it makes sense. One person says, I'm working on a manuscript dissertation on the intersection of disability and slavery. So they had some familiarity. I can see how that might be the case. Some folks are saying they learned it in MSW programs or other school programs. Other folks that it was not covered in their school programs. I think this information is not super available for a reason. People would lose it if they saw these patterns in history laid out. Yeah, some folks saying they worked as an advanced psychiatric nurse in the profession, was aware. I'm actively trying to deconstruct this. This is something new for me. It explains a lot of how the system harms Black people. We learned some of this through sharing family and community stories. We knew Black men were over-medicated. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Wasn't aware of the direct linkage to the civil rights. Oh my gosh, 52 new messages. Good Lord.
Well, let me just, I'll jump in really quickly and just, you know, I really appreciate the discussion and the honesty, and yeah, just kind of really thinking about, for those that haven't heard it, all the different factors, right? There's probably a ton of stuff that we don't know, either because it was washed over, either because you know, we kind of catered to a certain audience, or it wasn't beneficial to the consumers, right? And I love that. At least I hope that this is giving at least some motivation to really start to question some of what we've learned and question kind of what we know about schizophrenia, about mental health, as you know, oftentimes what we hear is a biased interpretation of the history. So I just love what you guys are saying. I love that people are researching this. I love that people have already been exposed to this, and just kind of understanding that these systems that we are in are made by men, are made by men with particular views. And of course, what we learn is going to be shaped by their perceptions. So always question these things. And particularly when it comes to schizophrenia, question who's giving the disorder, the diagnoses, question what's really going on, and what are the implicit ways that bias is stepping in. Okay. I'm gonna just kind of, I'm just noticing the comments coming in, and I love this. People interested in kind of learning a little bit more.
I do want to just, oh, sorry, I don't mean to cut you off. I wanted to let folks know, because a couple people have been asking about sharing the presentation afterwards and kind of how this is all going to work. Two things that I want to emphasize. Yes, I am going to save the chat, and I'm going to consolidate and share I know a lot of folks have mentioned books and articles, which is great. And I'm going to be including that in our follow-up thank you email. So everyone will receive it, not just the folks who attend, everyone who registered will receive that. We're not able to share the slides, unfortunately, but as I said, the recording will also be sent out afterwards, and you can look through and, you know, take notes on a particular slide in the recording if you'd like. And there are a couple of folks, I know Dr. Smith is going to be sharing his contact information at the end. A couple of folks mentioned wanting to, that this presentation would be really helpful for their residency program or other school program. And that's, we will be sharing, Dr. Smith has been kind enough to share his contact information, and I'm sure would be very interested to share. I don't want to speak for you, but I'm sure you would want to share that with some educational programs, especially.
Yes, absolutely. Whatever you guys need, just please feel free to reach out. I'm going to just kind of quickly just here's some resources. I don't often give resources because I think there's so many good ones, and it really kind of depends on what you're interested in. Here's just a kind of a quick, here's the protest psychosis book. I really recommend, if you're interested in this topic, to just take a look. It's by Jonathan Metzel, and he goes through the evolution of schizophrenia, and particularly how it evolved, again, to be something assigned predominantly to Black people. Here's the article that I kind of paused on, that kind of rang a lot of the alarms, by Bromberg and Simon. You could easily access this online. It's called Protest Psychosis. So the book is a response to this article. And this is the article that just had some really wild claims about Black people that experience psychosis. And then just an article that I think is a really good starter is this article by Dr. Ruth Shim entitled Structural Racism is Why I'm Leaving Organized Psychiatry. And this really unpacks a lot of the why, right? The structural issues, the structural forces that are constantly at play in our field, unfortunately. With regards to services, I apologize that this is a very small list. There are a ton of different services. This service, On Track New York, is very specific to psychosis, particularly for young folks, and it has a lot of the same types of lens, very affirming in terms of understanding structural and racial issues when it comes to treatment. And it's a really good resource for anyone on this group, loved ones that might be having a young person in their life that is struggling with psychosis and the emergence of psychosis. And the idea is, how do we change the pipeline that we spoke about earlier? As was mentioned, Clara mentioned, if you need more articles, resources, please feel free to contact me. Here's my email. It's drstephenmsmith@gmail.com. Yeah, if you guys need anything, I'm here. So please feel free to reach out. And I don't
So with that, there's been a couple of questions in the chat that throughout that I think I would love to discuss a little bit before we wrap up at 7:30. I wanted to start one question that I think is maybe a good place to start. One person wanted to know what gave you the idea to dig deeper into this topic. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh wow, that's a great question. I mean, I think just that first statistic of the overdiagnosis of psychosis, of schizophrenia, really just lends itself to more questions and answers. And again, this is not my research. This is from Dr. Metzel's book. He actually did all of the digging. I just really kind of was really interested in what was written and just kind of interspersed some of my own thoughts. So he would be a better source for like understanding kind of the evolution. But for me, it was, I have a private practice. I also work in an early intervention program. And regardless of how good the treatment is, when you still see more Black people diagnosed with schizophrenia, Black people diagnosed with psychosis. So we really got to understand why that is, right? Just saying that that's because Black people experience it more is not enough, and that's frankly not true. There's so many ways that implicit bias creeps in. And then when you think of all the different systems and how bias exists in systems, you'll see, again, this through line that the way we see Black people, the way we see Black men in particular, suggests we use a different lens. We use a lens of aggression, of hostility, of behavioral, lack of behavioral control. And so it makes sense that it shows up everywhere. I'm always going to be interested in that. I'm interested in why people call the cops for, psychiatric conditions, particularly when the individual is Black, right? And this is not just mental health professionals, but why family members do, right? Why do we do that? And there's something that we all kind of universally attribute to Black behaviors and Black bodies. And we have to just kind of figure that out.
Thank you. A couple of people had questions, which I think are really great that I want to address about what do we do, right? The first one, which I think I'm not sure what the answer is, but as all this was going on, particularly in the 60s and 70s, were there groups or a group of Black psychiatrists that were opposing some of these characterizations, or other, maybe not just of psychiatrists, but of people who were specifically pointing out some of those characterizations and fighting back?
Yeah, and that was a great question. All along our history, there are people that are standing out and pointing these things out, right? And so, yes, absolutely. The way to do it is to, if you can advocate. If you can get involved in systems change, great. If you can get involved with just kind of something a little bit more on the individual level, it could be something as simple as reminding yourself that bias is everywhere, that there's implicit bias everywhere, right? Something that simple redirection can actually help to evade kind of the common traps when we start to label people and label people's behavior, particularly those with mental health concerns. So there's people intervening at multiple levels. There's ways that we are now changing the assessments to include like trauma, structural issues, whether this person is kind of any cultural issues that are impacting or can better explain their behavior. So there's a lot of ways that the system is adjusting, but also know the system can correct itself at any point and get back to the status quo. So we kind of constantly have to keep our mind sharp and remind ourselves of bias seeping in, remind ourselves of these structural issues, remind ourselves of these cultural issues. I know that's a very vague response, but we could actually impact the system and impact this work on multiple levels.
Can you talk a little bit about sorry, where did it go? Can you talk, this might be outside the scope of this presentation, but can you talk about if this kind of thing has also been the case for other mental illnesses, other diagnoses, kind of with how psychiatry has operated more broadly?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there is definitely bias in a lot of different disorders. So whereas Black people, Black men in particular, are more likely diagnosed with schizophrenia, white people or white men are more likely diagnosed with mood disorders, right? So it's kind of like the opposite side of the coin. We know that there's bias in diagnoses of personality disorders like borderline, right? That's typically seen as a disorder affecting women, right? But we know that a lot of men actually experience borderline personality disorder. They're just being misdiagnosed, right? So you always see kind of the pendulum swing towards one group more than the other, despite a very rigorous and empirically supported system. It's still, again, bias creeps in. And I would also, which I think is more the fascinating piece of this, is paying attention to the social context. What's going on in society that's also impacting like the way that we diagnose, right? What is going on globally? Like there's been waves of certain disorders, right? There's waves of OCD disorder. We go through a period of everybody gets an OCD diagnosis, everybody gets an Asperger's diagnosis, everybody gets an ADHD diagnosis. I would be very interested in what was going on socially in the social context that maybe influenced that trend. And again, it's not to say that it wasn't happening, that people weren't actually experiencing that, but we have to account for the way that these external pressures impact our decision making. I hope that answered the question. I think I might have gotten a little bit away from the question. My apologies.
I think that's great. I know some folks are asking about the 988 number, and I'm going to see if we can share some links and information about that. But just on a practical level, somebody asked about this. On a practical level, is there a process by which an individual can have a diagnosis of schizophrenia reevaluated and changed if they or their loved ones believe that they've been misdiagnosed?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it depends on the setting. You know, hospital settings probably harder to change a diagnosis because it informs medication, it informs discharge, informs a lot of different things. Outpatient, you probably have more wiggle room in at least advocating for what you feel you might be experiencing, what your loved one might be experiencing. I don't know of any specific mechanism that that impacts that you could address and confront that can impact your decision making. I will be honest, in my private practice, I usually will ask people, what do you think is happening for you, right? Don't let me decide what's happening for you. Don't let me decide what's going in your record. You tell me, what do you think this is that you're experiencing, right? And that becomes what we use, right? So that's kind of my practice. And that way it's just kind of putting the decision-making power back in the client's hands. And I know that there are people that kind of would argue in terms of the accuracy, but I really feel like having clients determine what goes in their records and what their diagnosis is powerful. Now, it doesn't mean we're not providing psychoeducation. We're not providing them our expert opinion, right? We might also just kind of say like, well, you know, given what we know about this disorder, it seems like you might be more consistent with that. We still have a role to play in terms of our knowledge and helping people. But I think ultimately, if you're able to give clients, patients, the power to decide how they want to be labeled, we should.
Another question, a couple people have emphasized this question. How do you recommend that Black providers check their own implicit biases?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, I think just that statement alone is powerful because, again, it's not just that white people or white providers or non-Black providers have bias. We all have bias. And I think a lot of attention was paid towards cultural competence and understanding other cultures and getting proficient in what we know about other cultures, when really there's no way we can know everything about other cultures. There's no way that we could, even if we did know, that we could say that this is definitive for this person and their culture. It's more important to check in with yourself, more important to check in with why you are prescribing a certain medication, or whether you're using a treatment intervention that is very focused on personal responsibility, a very westernized view of behavior, as opposed to a more collective view or environmental view of behavior. Right. So it really starts with your ability to self-reflect and check in with yourself. Despite what you know about your patients, despite what you know about your clients, you have to constantly check with yourself and question, like, why did I make that suggestion to the person, right? Why did I refer to the person this way? So I'm, the only thing I could say is we need to engender both kind of a practice of checking in with yourself, but also maybe some more concrete ways that people have to check in with themselves before they see clients, before they make any assessments. And this is for Black mental health professionals, white mental health professionals, anyone. So yeah, again, I apologize if that doesn't answer your question all the way.
No, I think that's great. This is a little bit of a tangent, but a couple of people again, we're sort of curious about in the charts that that you had of the terms that were used to describe patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. One of the terms was homosexual, and a couple of folks were curious about that as a descriptor.
Yeah, it's interesting. There was in reading through the book, there's a heavy emphasis on sexuality, that doctors were somewhat obsessed with understanding the kind of sexual behaviors of their patients, and we actually see that in a lot of different ways. And then homosexuality was also seen as kind of as being a mental illness, right? As further evidence of a lack of normalcy. They pathologize sexual behavior, particularly homosexuality. So I want to say that it was kind of just used as further proof that these individuals were quote unquote abnormal, as was defined at that time. And then it goes to, were they really exhibiting that behavior, or were the psychiatrists, clinicians looking for that? Were they seeing things that weren't really there? Were they ascribing deficit or maladaptive behavior to things that weren't really maladaptive? So yeah, I wish I could definitively answer that question, but that's my guess.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And there are definitely, I was saving questions as we went, but we're definitely not going to be able to get to all of them.
Right.
I do want to, and maybe we can do two more. Let's do two more. One, can you speak about, can you say a little bit more about the schizophrenia, the treatment of schizophrenia, sort of using therapy versus antipsychotic medication and therapy? So sort of you talked a little bit about the emphasis on medication to the exclusion of therapy. Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that in treatment?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So there's no unifying etiology of schizophrenia, right? There's no kind of one route to schizophrenia. There's been a ton of research that shows people develop schizophrenia because of a genetic predisposition, or biological issues, or trauma, or stress. There are all these different pathways and avenues towards someone developing psychosis and schizophrenia. Substance use is another one, right? So as a result, treatment before was focused on, this is a brain disease. right? We have to treat this chemically, right? And that was the heavy emphasis on medication. But because there's no unified theory, no unified ideology, there needs to be multiple ways of treating schizophrenia. And so psychotherapy is often seen as a great route to treating schizophrenia, like talk therapy. A lot of the kind of the maximum benefits are when talk therapy is used in conjunction with medication, but therapy actually works. And what they're also seeing, particularly a lot of research is focused on early psychosis, is that it's not even just talk therapy, but if we can help people get to the things that they want, right? Their recovery goals, the things that really drive them, and provide services in a way that's reassuring, that's strengths-based, that's collaborative, that puts the person at the center, you can actually do a lot to change the trajectory, right? And that's kind of the resource on track that I shared. That's their philosophy, is there's a comprehensive approach to psychosis that really addresses not just the biological, but addresses the social factors, the trauma, the interpersonal. How do we get this person back to their lives? And that is often independent of medication, right? This is really just treating people like people, really addressing the person and not the patient, right? And again, medication helps. Medication has done wonders for folks. But there's a part of treatment that really taps into the person that I think works well for people that are in early phases, as well as people that are kind of, experiencing psychosis for a long time. And the other thing I will say is psychosis, schizophrenia, I know it sounds scary, but it really can boil down to very universal experiences, right? When somebody has a grandiose belief, for instance, that they are Jesus or they're dating Barack Obama, right? Really think about, what is that about, right? The idea on the surface is that they are important, they are, they're special, but they might on the inside feel the opposite, that they're not important, not special, right? And we could help with that. We could tap into that. We could help people feel special and important, right? So this idea that schizophrenia is this weird thing, it's not really. It's actually, it comes from a lot of the same places where you and I struggle, right? And our role is, instead of running away from it and medicating and controlling it, our role is to kind of run towards it, engage it, right? Understand it, walk with it, and really understand kind of the universalness of the experience.
Thank you so much. For our very last question, this is what I wanted to end on, although I know we're a little bit over. What can we do about some of these things that you talked about, these structural issues within the mental health system, particularly if we don't work in psychiatry/psychology?
It's a big question. I mean, I think we first have to understand what are the structural issues, right? An example might be kind of this distinction between structural and cultural, right? I think as a society, we got into the cultural, but we haven't gotten to the structural. So I think a lot needs to happen to understand the structural. An example might be a Black client comes into your office and they don't show up for therapy. Now, the cultural explanation might be, well, this person, Black people are stigmatized by mental health. They don't trust the system. So that explains their behavior. A structural explanation might be, maybe there's, where they live, there's a lack of access to reliable transportation, right? Or maybe they're in school and they're at a school that doesn't provide as much financial support, so they have to prioritize other things over it. So it's the structural actually is, if we could see that there are other forces that are impacting why this person decides to show up in the office or not. And then we could start to help. Maybe our job isn't to get them to come to therapy. Maybe our job is to make sure that we help them connect to a more reliable train, or maybe we help them connect better to food resources. A lot of communities of color in kind of low SES neighborhoods live in food deserts. So how do we help change those deserts and provide kind of the same food and resources that are often found in other neighborhoods? right? So it's like, it's really about, yeah, we want to help the person, but we need to start to fix the structure surrounding the person, right? The environment surrounding the person. And that's, I wish I could and nail it down into more concrete, but that's what we need to spend more of our time doing. These kind of helping the ecosystem and not just focusing on the individual.
I think that's a really powerful note to end on. We're a little bit over, so yeah, we do need to wrap it up. Thank you everyone so much for really making use of this full, slightly more than 90 minutes. We really appreciate hearing from all of you, your participation in the chat, your questions, your input. I will be, I'm saving it right now. The chat has been saved. So we will
Great.
be incorporating some of the resources that were shared into the thank you email that we will be sending out. The recording will be available on our Facebook page and on our YouTube page. And please share this information with folks in your life. Thank you. With that, we will say good night.
All right. Thank you guys. Thanks for having me.